Shannon, how many children's lives could have been saved? That is one of the central questions being asked tonight as the South Florida community comes to grips with the heart-wrenching revelation that the lone police officer in charge of protecting Marjory Stoneman Douglas High chose to wait outside the building rather than rush in to stop the shooter as 17 kids were being murdered. Today, the Broward County Sheriff Scott Israel said that Deputy Scott Peterson waited outside the building for about 4 minutes as gunshots rang inside. And Deputy Peterson, he was armed with a gun and was in uniform. And after reviewing surveillance video and interviewing witnesses, Sheriff Israel suspended Peterson without pay. The deputy chose instead to resign.
But what I saw was a deputy arrive at the west side of Building 12, take up a position, and he never went in. When we in law enforcement arrive at an active shooter, we go in and address the target, and that's what should have been done. Devastated, sick to my stomach. There are no words.
4 minutes, the 54-year-old officer waited outside. The shooting lasted 6. And Shannon, tonight, reportedly, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office is now protecting Officer Peterson and his family at their request.
Well, and Brian, the FBI also speaking out today. They continue to be pressed on why they failed to follow up on some of the warning tips that came in about the shooter.
That's right, Shannon. 2 tips in the 4 months before this shooting is what the FBI got, including a call that came in on January 5th from someone close to Nicholas Cruz who called the FBI National Call Center. Well, today the FBI's acting deputy director acknowledged their call center did not follow protocol in choosing not to pass the tip along that this kid was thinking about shooting up a school, not passing that tip to the Miami's field office.
Now, let me be clear. There was a mistake made. We know that. But it is our job to make sure that we do everything in our power to ensure that does not happen again. It is not easy work. I'm not making excuses because what happened was a tragedy, truly a tragedy.
Now, Florida's governor, the NRA, and President Trump all pummeling the FBI over the mishandling of this case. And then Bowditch said today he acknowledged that his biggest concern right now is the public losing confidence in his agency. Shannon.
Brian Yanes live for us in South Florida. Thank you very much, Brian. And with this stunning news about the Broward deputy in mind, and as the NRA calls for more guns and more security at schools, we go now to Rich Edson standing by live.
Good evening, Shannon. And the NRA and NRA leadership making its first comments since this shooting in Parkland, Florida, and did so extensively here at CPAC. Wayne LaPierre, the head of the NRA, criticized Democrats, elites, the media, those calling for stricter gun control laws. This is after a week of protests in Tallahassee, Florida, and elsewhere throughout the country for those calling for gun control measures. LaPierre says that that's not the answer because laws only succeed when people follow them. He says schools need armed security. He says Americans protect banks, airports, and sporting events far better than their own children, leaving schools as open targets. He blamed these repeated school shootings on what he says was, quote, the failure of school security, the failure of family, the failure of America's mental health system, and even the unbelievable failure of the FBI. The NRA says those calling for stricter gun laws are opportunists and exploiting the Florida high school tragedy.
As usual, the opportunist. For them, it's not a safety issue. It's a political issue. They care more about control and more of it. Their goal is to eliminate the Second Amendment and our firearms freedoms so they can eradicate all individual freedoms. The shameful politicization of tragedy, it's a classic tragedy right out of the playbook of a poisonous movement.
LaPierre is a supporter of the president. He says not even President Trump's election can turn the tide of European-style socialism that is bearing down on the United States. As for the president, he spent much of the week at the White House hosting a number of gun conversations there. The president says he agrees with the NRA that there should be more armed security at schools, though the way the president would do it, and this is what he tweeted out, specifically he describes it as highly trained gun-adept teachers and coaches. president also tweeted, quote, "I will be strongly pushing comprehensive background checks with an emphasis on mental health, raise age to 21 and end sale of bump stocks. Congress is in a mood to finally do something on this issue, I hope." And that goes further than what LaPierre outlined today at CPAC, though the president still says that the NRA is on board with some type of changes.
They're not going to walk into a school if 20% of the teachers have guns. It may be 10%, or maybe 40%. And what I'd recommend doing is the people that do carry, we give them a bonus. We give them a little bit of a bonus.
What exactly ends up coming out of Washington is still unclear. Perhaps the president will talk about it a little bit more tomorrow here at CPAC, or pretty much anything else he wants to discuss. He's got the floor here shortly after 10 a.m. Shannon?
All right, it'll be a rousing day there, I think, at CPAC as they welcome him excitedly. Rich, thank you very much. Well, first it was the missed FBI tip. Today, the county sheriff's revealing a stunning set of failures by one of his deputies. Joining me now with reaction, Henderson Stuart McDonald, who was with the president today actually discussing possible solutions to the issue of school violence. Great to have you with us, Sheriff.
Great to be here, Shannon.
Okay, so let's go back to this revelation that we have now from Sheriff Israel down in Broward County saying there was a deputy. He was there, he set up, he took a position outside, but apparently, according to witnesses in video, he never went in. Here is what Sheriff Israel had to say about this.
When the shooter was still inside the building?
Yes, he was.
And so what should he have done?
Went in, addressed the killer, killed the killer.
He says that's what should have happened with this deputy. It's hard for us to know what was happening in the chaos there.
Sure.
What's your take?
I believe so. Deputies, officers now are trained to move to the threat and take care of the situation. It sounds to me, from what I'm seeing or hearing, that this was an officer who was totally overwhelmed by the stress of the situation, who evidently wasn't properly trained. Maybe they thought he was, but something happened that caused him to fail to do what is a very unnatural thing to do, and that is move towards a son of gunfire by yourself. But nonetheless, that's the oath he takes to do. That's something we hope that all officers know they're signing up for when they sign up to do the job. It's a tough job, but putting a badge and a gun on somebody doesn't necessarily make them adept at the job that they've got to do, and that's something we need to be very, very aware of.
Yeah, and I would imagine that a lot of folks who are trained to be at schools, it's often because they're good with students, or that's something that they have a heart for. Most resource officers who go to school don't think this is something they're going to face. Now, all of them, I'm sure, are thinking about it every day when they walk in. Right,
I think it's changed a lot. Back when DARE first became that program that put officers in schools with kids, they were really there for teaching, for mentoring, and a lot of times the officers that went there were people, like you said, who specifically were children-oriented, but not necessarily the guys that would be on the tactical team or working the beat. I'm not saying that was always the case, but that was a lot of it. What's happened over the years is the armed guard responsibility has now fallen on those DARE officers, and so law enforcement across this nation is really looking at how they do training. Obviously, we've shifted a lot in our thinking even from Columbine to now. But again, there needs to be a lot more put into the officers who do have that responsibility to know that they're not there just to mentor kids, that their job is a very dangerous one, and if it happens on their watch, they're usually there by themselves.
Yeah, they often are. Okay, so let's talk about your meeting with the president today. He, in a tweet today, talked about all kinds of things, background checks, emphasis on mental health, raising the age potentially to 21 on long gun purchases, ending the sale of bump stocks. What did you talk about today that you thought may actually come to fruition and be helpful? One
of the things I was really impressed with, I didn't want to show up to something that was just going to be a photo op, and I could tell by the caliber of the people that were around that table. They all had great ideas, and they all wanted to be there to help solve the problem. I can see that the president really, a lot of compassion for what's happened, but sees this momentum to make something happen positively. He was very open to the mental health issue, which I think is something that has been overlooked. That's very serious in this nation. I know it is in North Carolina. A lot of people fall through the cracks. We heard from the Attorney General Pam Bondi and the Commissioner with Kentucky State Police about some programs they had, fusion centers, gathering information, just a lot of good things going on. Then we heard from the mental health side, a lot of ideas they have that they'd like to see put in place too. The president was very adamant about arming the right kind of personnel within the school system. I'm one of the few people, I guess, that goes along with that. Again, it's not giving anybody a gun and hoping they'll do what they need to do, but it's training, vetting people very well. I like to say, you know, in the skies over this nation, we have armed passengers flying on aircraft all the time. They're called air marshals, and nobody knows exactly who they are or where they are, but the fact that they're there and they don't really stand out certainly has been a large contribution to the fact that we haven't had any hijacking since 9/11.
Well, and they're the first person I look for when I get on the plane as well. And just knowing it's there does have a mental impact on how you view the conduct on that plane. Sheriff, thank you very much for stopping in while you're in town. And we know that all the things the president has talked about will be helpful to law enforcement officers across the spectrum.
They were very encouraging. I have a lot of hope for that. Thank you.
Right. We would like to, too. Thank you very much. All right, both the head of the NRA, Wayne LaPierre, and right-wing French former parliamentarian Marion Marlache Le Pen addressed CPAC today, warning about a growing move to give the government more power at the cost of your personal freedom.
If these so-called European socialists take over the House and the Senate, and God forbid they get the White House again, our American freedoms could be lost.
We need to convey our idea across the media, the culture, and the education to stop the domination of the liberal and socialists.
All right, both of those speakers generating plenty of controversy today. Let's talk about it with Matt Schlapp, the chairman of the American Conservative Union, which hosts CPAC, and Philippe Reines, a former senior advisor to Hillary Clinton. Great to see both of you gentlemen tonight.
Hi, Shannon.
Okay, I want to play a little bit more of what Wayne LaPierre had to say, and then we'll get your reaction.
Students who are just changing the nature of the debate. And three, I think they've got a president that they're worried about will cave. I mean, he's saying, I know the NRA knows me, and I think he wants to go further than they're comfortable with. And I can see why he's upset, but the rhetoric is hardly very, you know, grieving or conciliatory at a week after we've lost 17 Americans.
Well, let's ask Matt. You were there. What's your take?
My take is I'm proud of Wayne for coming to CPAC and for addressing the issue. It would have been easier for him just to take a pass and hope that passions subside and to talk about this later. But CPAC was here, and it's the appropriate thing as a country for us all to put it on the table. You know, Wayne's an important leader in this fight for our Bill of Rights, and this is chiseled in our Constitution, as we all know. This is not some whim or some law that the Republicans were able to push through. This is about the very establishment of our country, and there's a reason for that. And so before we rush to judgment that it's all about the guns and it's all about restricting guns, we have to have a cooler head, and we have to think about what's going on in society. And what's going on in society is a turn to violence, unlike we see in other societies and in other countries. There's something wrong with America. There's something wrong with the heart and soul of America. We can all talk about guns all we want, but I think it's actually much deeper than that. And until we start talking about the problems of the heart and the problems of this darkness that's creeping in, we're not going to solve these problems.
Yeah, and I think most folks would admit that it is a multi-pronged, very difficult, ugly problem, and it's not just one thing that's going to solve it. I want to talk about the other controversy today for you guys, Matt, because this was Marion Le Pen speaking today. Here is what she had to say.
You have succeeded in putting conservatism right back on the top of the political agenda. Let us build on what you have achieved here, so that on both sides of the Atlantic, a conservative agenda may prevail.
Now, you know, a lot of folks think that conservative here and conservative in Europe can mean two very different things. Glenn Beck tweeting this to you, Matt. He says, I like you. I like where you told me CPAC was headed. Last year, we spoke about Milo. You did the right thing. Now, a national socialist, Le Pen. Please come on radio today and help us understand what CPAC is thinking. European conservatives are very different. You had to know you were going to get some backlash.
Yeah, I think people see too much of my face and hear too much of my voice, Shannon. I don't think the problem is I'm not on enough radio or television shows. So I'm happy to always be on with Glenn, who I also respect. But this is the problem with lingo. Marion Le Pen is not a socialist. She's not a national socialist in how we understand in America. Matter of fact, she's trying to fight socialism. She used the word conservative over and over again in her speech. And what does she mean by that? She means that the family is the building block of society. Although she has the personal tragedy of a divorce in her life, she's a single mom, and she talks about the fact that families must be strong for countries to prosper. She believes in traditional marriage. She's pro-life. She doesn't think that once there's fetal pain, there should be any abortions. And in France, that's quite a bold statement where that doesn't happen anymore. She doesn't believe that the welfare state will solve our problems. I wish people, even in my own movement, would stop attacking people before they even have a chance to sit down and listen to them. She gave a very compelling conservative speech.
I want to make sure, Philippe, we're almost out of time. 10 seconds. Anything you'd like to say? Vote. And yes, it makes it more likely to vote Republican. That from a voter who stayed away from the polls in 2016. Now, on the hot topic of guns and the Second Amendment, it's usually a winner for the GOP, but Democrats say they are going to embrace gun control as a midterm issue this time around. Not necessarily everywhere, though. According to one Senate Democratic aide, quote, it's not going to be a top-down every state strategy. Some places it'll work. Illinois, Florida, and Colorado's suburban districts, and other places it will not, like North Carolina. Fox News politics editor Chris Stirewalt is here to discuss. Good to see you.
How you doing, homie?
This is a tough topic, but Democrats think it could be a winner for them in the fall. Not everywhere, but in a lot of places. What say you?
Well, this isn't like taxes. This isn't like other economic issues. This is a social issue, and it is. Look, we saw last night and today something pretty remarkable. The cable news network, CNN, had a town hall last night. It was astonishing, the amount of hate, the amount of intensity, the booing, the jeering. Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, and they're heaping this scorn, and he's standing there as they're just pummeling him. And then I watched Wayne LaPierre today from the other side, from the NRA, basically dehumanizing his opponents. These people are socialists. Anybody who is in favor of reforms here or changes here is coming for your guns, and you should be afraid of them. There is powder keg after powder keg after powder keg underneath this issue. Democrats found out in the 90s when they passed an assault weapon ban. They did it, and that is the ghost that Staffer was talking about. If you do it top down and you do it in a way that upsets voters in rural districts or certainly some suburban districts, it has terrible consequences. And Democrats lost a ton of seats in 1994. But on the other side, for Republicans, the emotionality of this issue, especially with suburban residents, especially with people in the kind of places where this school is, and especially for moms, this is, if the Republicans can't demonstrate by the time they get to November that they have answers here. It doesn't have to be gun control, but it has to be humane, it has to be effective, it has to be engaged. They can't keep doing what they've been doing, which is essentially quietly celebrating the fact that they have stopped responses. Newtown, Las Vegas, that nothing happened. Nothing is not going to cut it. They're going to have to do something.
Well, it's interesting because Democrats are playing this very carefully, too. In thehill.com, there was an article where they said this: as the issue continues to dominate the headlines, some Democrats back an understated approach, particularly with vulnerable Democrats like Senators Heidi Heitkamp and Joe Manchin, who are up for re-election in red states. So this may not be their battle cry.
And so how about this? So if you are the Democratic Party and you need a 50-state strategy, if they want to win back the House, which they can, if they want to win back the House, they've got to be able to pinpoint these various districts and have things that work there. But if you do a national strategy, I'll put it to you this way. If the new rallying cry in the Democratic Party is that you cannot be with the NRA and you cannot take any money from them,
they're going to have to stop taking it, too.
There's some Democratic senators who'd be in trouble. So in every election, a big question is, how far can you stretch to persuade voters without losing your base? And on issues like gun control and on issues like mass shootings, the lines get taut very, very quickly.
Chris Stirewalt, good to see you, and your glasses. Give the people a look.
Here, there you go.
I mean, he looks even smarter than ever.
Quite
there
so.
You go. Come back soon.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, there are new charges tonight against the president's former campaign manager, campaign chairman Paul Manafort, and a longtime business associate of Manafort's, Rick Gates. Manafort's spokesman put out a statement at this late hour, quote, the new allegations against Mr. Manafort, once again, have nothing to do with Russia and 2016 election interference collusion. Mr. Manafort is confident that he will be acquitted and violations of his constitutional rights will be remedied. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge has more on the new indictments. Good evening, Catherine.
Shannon, the former Trump aides are charged with more financial crimes in 2 federal jurisdictions, Washington, D.C., and now a separate 32-count indictment in Virginia over bank and tax fraud for allegedly laundering more than $30 million. A source close to the case calling it classic legal pile-on as dueling political memos over surveillance abuse during the 2016 election enter a new phase.
The House Intelligence Committee's ranking Democrat Adam Schiff says he wants their counter memo out this week, and negotiations with the FBI over what sections will be blacked out or redacted are nearly complete. A White House spokesman said there will be no holdup on their end if national security concerns are resolved.
Once it meets the FBI's standards for ensuring that law enforcement sensitive and sources and methods are protected, we would support its release.
Just like the Republican staff memo released earlier this month, a source close to the process said the Democrats' version will likely require the president to declassify it. The Republican memo drafted by Committee Chairman Devin Nunes' team alleged surveillance abuse by the FBI and Justice Department during the 2016 election. Republican investigators found the departments knew the Trump dossier was funded by the DNC and Clinton campaign, but withheld specifics from a national security court when it applied and renewed surveillance warrants for Carter Page, a Trump campaign aide. Committee Republicans say the counter memo is unlikely to directly challenge the finding. Committee Democrats say the Republican account is deeply flawed.
The FBI and the DOJ are comprised of very good people, not acting politically and doing their work on the American people's behalf. So I do want to see that Democratic refutation, because, again, that memo will show that a lot of the allegations that were made in the Nunes memo were not correct.
In a separate development, Fox News confirms David J. Kramer, a former State Department official and associate of Senator John McCain, has invoked his Fifth Amendment right not to testify before the House panel about the dossier's Russian sources. Kramer, who was briefed on the dossier by its author, former British spy Christopher Steele, was a critical link in the dossier's handoff to the FBI after the 2016 election.
Fox News asked why Kramer took the Fifth and whether he helped get the dossier to BuzzFeed, who published it in January 2017. There was no comment from Kramer or his attorney. Shannon?
Catherine Herridge, thank you very much. Well, Wisconsin's overhauling its welfare system. Governor Scott Walker will join us to tell us why the controversial plans could wind up being a model for a whole lot of other states. All right, it's all about timing, or is it? Questions about the claims of an ex-Playboy model who says she had an affair with the president. And pro-life meets anti-gun.